Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the choices in some of my favorite games and figure out which decision is the right one. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and in this episode, we're diving back into TellTale Games' The Walking Dead Season 1, this time getting into Episode 2. In case you missed Episode 1, I've linked a playlist for the series in the description below. As I continue to break down episodes, I'll add them to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Episode 2 is titled Starved for Help, and we pick up 3 months after the end of Episode 1. The group has been living at the motel, having fortified it, and established a routine to keep everyone safe and alive. At some point over the time jump, the group has welcomed a new member, Mark, who had been surviving in a bunker stocked with food. That food has run out, and the episode opens with Lee and Mark walking through the woods hunting for something to eat. We learn through dialogue that Kenny and Lily have been fighting a lot, and there's a lot of discord in the group because of that. Things are at a breaking point, and they are in desperate need of something positive. Just as they are contemplating shooting a blackbird, a scream breaks the tranquility. They rush toward the disturbance, worried that it might be Kenny, who's been hunting nearby, and wind up discovering a group of 3 men not far away. One of the men is lying on the ground, and it quickly becomes clear that he stepped in a bear trap. The group appear to be affiliated with some local school, and the 2 who are standing refer to the man trapped as their teacher while begging for help. A check of the trap reveals the mechanism used to unlock it has been disabled, and there is only one way to free the man. To make matters worse, the man's screaming has attracted some zombies, and you only have a few seconds to make a decision. Do you free the man or let him die? Freeing him means cutting his leg off, but leaving him to die would almost be worse. Is there a morally right thing to do in this circumstance? On the surface, it's actually pretty straightforward. Cutting his leg off and carrying him back is more humane. Letting the zombies rip into him, slowly killing him, would amount to allowing him to be tortured. Not to mention, losing a leg is often preferable to losing a life. When you look at a system like secular morality, where the goal is to maximize human well-being, cutting off the leg becomes an even clearer choice. The best outcome in the scenario would be to get him back to the motor inn and help him recover over time. But we also need to consider the group in our calculations. Bringing a man with a freshly amputated leg back means using medical supplies and food on a complete stranger. Those supplies are very limited as it is, and someone in his condition would undoubtedly use much more than the group was ready to give up. Maybe he'd recover enough in the long run to be an asset to the group, but in the short term, he might use something that winds up hurting the group as a whole. What if Clementine got hurt, for example, and Lee was unable to save her life because they were out of something? In the heat of the moment, those kinds of thoughts would probably escape most people, though. A man's life is at stake, and the instant reaction is to do what needs to be done. Of course, we also have the ability to play out each scenario in this game. Cutting the man's leg off, the group rushes back to the motor inn. As they are leaving the area, though, one of the boys trips over a rock and winds up eaten by zombies. So Lee, Mark, and Kenny arrive back at the motor inn with Ben, one of the students, and the other man, David, who is missing one leg. Kenny's wife, Katja, gets to work on the man in an attempt to save his life as Kenny and Lily argue about bringing him back in the first place. That argument winds up centering around food, and after a lot of back and forth, Lily hands the day's rations to Lee and tells him to figure out who gets to eat that day, so he can see what it's like to make the difficult decision. Who you choose to feed doesn't really make a huge difference later on, but it can be rather tough to pick 4 people out of the group of what is now 10 to feed. This isn't so much of a moral dilemma as it is a nutritional decision, but it does make you think about how you might go about distributing rations in a similar situation. Nutritional guidelines vary by person, of course, but generally speaking, most people need at least 2,000 calories a day to maintain a healthy weight. The options for food on this particular day include half an apple, a piece of beef jerky, and 2 crackers and cheese snack packs. Half an apple amounts to about 40 calories, the beef jerky would be about 80 calories, and the crackers and cheese packs would be about 180 calories each. None of those would even come close to the recommended daily intake, which is a big part of why tempers are so high in the group. Hunger makes people do some crazy things and act irrationally. When you're done handing out the food, Katja calls you and Kenny over to let you know that David didn't make it. As her and Lee are discussing what to do with Ben, David grabs her from behind and starts trying to eat her. Lee manages to help her escape, getting in a physical fight with David in the process. Carly winds up shooting David, and the group erupts into chaos as they assume Ben had concealed the fact that David was bit before winding up in the bear trap. And that is when Ben reveals that someone doesn't have to be bit to come back as a zombie. Before the group can even process what they've learned, they are interrupted by a pair of men emerging from the woods across the street from the motor inn. But before we move forward, we should look back at what happens if we don't save David. What if we chose not to bring back a man with a missing leg? As it so happens, the scenario plays out pretty much the same, with one change being that instead of a man with one leg, you're bringing back a man with a gunshot wound. Ben's classmate, Travis, who was eaten as you escaped with David, winds up fighting Mark for a gun, shooting himself in the process. They bring him back to camp instead of David, and everything plays out the same from there. No matter who you bring back, you wind up with Carly pointing her gun at a pair of strangers. They're holding a gas can and talking about how they're just looking for gas for their generators. They say they own a dairy farm a few miles away and that it's protected by an electric fence. The group seems a little too eager to believe this story, but that could easily be explained by the hunger they've been experiencing. Here's two men offering food to the group in exchange for some gas, and with how long it's been since anyone at the motor inn had a decent meal, it's no wonder they would jump to accept the offer. Let's just take a second to look at the situation rationally, though. The group has been vocal about needing food. They were just arguing amongst themselves about that very thing. And like magic, a pair of men come out of the woods with offers of food and shelter? While it does make sense the group wouldn't be acting rationally on an empty stomach, it does stick out and seem unrealistic that not a single person would point out how fishy the situation was. Even Lily and Kenny agree on going, and that says a lot considering how much they seem to hate each other. Lee, Mark, Ben, and Carly are selected to join the men, Andy and Dan St. John, and the group makes their way to the dairy farm. Along the way, they chat and get some more backstory on Lee, as well as some information about the farm. We are also introduced to a group of bandits, watching a pair of them argue before one kills the other. The bandits will play into the story more later on. That interaction aside, the group finishes their journey, and they arrive at the farm to find the friendly face of Brenda, Andy and Dan's mom. She's offering them a basket of freshly baked biscuits and seems overly joyed to be meeting new people. Carly and Ben wind up returning to the motor inn, with plans to send the rest of the group, while Lee and Mark stay behind to investigate the farm. The whole situation seems too good to be true, and it starts to unravel as Lee and Mark are attacked by the bandits from earlier while clearing zombies from the electric fence on the edge of the property. Mark is hit by an arrow in the shoulder, and the two barely get away with their lives. The rest of the group arrives just in time to see Mark stumbling back to the house with Lee in tow, and they actually start questioning if the farm is actually safe. The St. John brothers reveal they've been having some trouble with the bandits, but they assure the group that it will be handled. After another chance to look around, Lee goes with Dan to scout the area they think the bandits might be holed up in. This is where you have another big decision, and where the mystery of what's going on deepens. The pair find what appears to be a small camp, which Dan says is definitely the camp of the bandits, and while looking around, Lee finds Clementine's hat under a pillow in the tent. Before he can fully process what he's found, a woman's voice breaks the silence, telling him not to move.
The hell?
Don't you fucking move! Shit!
Put your guns down.
The woman is standing on the edge of the camp, pointing a crossbow at Lee, and before long, both Lee and Dan have their rifles trained on her as she seems to be rambling about the bandits and the St. John's. There are multiple chances to shoot her as she talks, but should you take a shot? If she wanted to kill you, she could have easily done so without saying a word. She chose to speak up and talk rather than shoot. The camp was likely hers, with that being reinforced by a photo in the tent, and she really had every right to threaten the strange men rummaging through it. It's clear she's been through some sort of trauma, and while she seems unhinged, she's also rational enough to know that killing either Lee or Dan would result in her being killed as well. Dan seems to think she's part of the bandit group, but the way she talks seems to rule this out as she alludes to the bandits having taken her daughter, as well as food and supplies. She threatens the men on multiple occasions, upping the threats but never firing her crossbow. Killing her after all she's been through might almost seem like a mercy. She seems to be extremely unstable and distraught, but the fact that she hasn't taken her own life through it all hints that she wants to come back from the terrible things that have happened. You could make the argument that she was trying to get the men to shoot her by ratcheting up the threats, but she could have accomplished that just by firing at one of them, even missing on purpose if she didn't want to hurt them. It's almost like she was pleading for help without saying it. Just like the decision earlier about whether to cut David's leg off, this one seems pretty clear-cut. Not shooting her would be the right thing to do. Showing some compassion and maybe even trying to help her recover from all the trauma she's been through would make the most sense from a moral perspective. Unlike earlier, though, you don't get to decide her ultimate fate. Dan winds up taking a shot, putting a bullet in her forehead right as she is mentioning something about the farm. He says he did it because she was going to shoot one of them, but the timing of it raises some questions and deepens the mystery. What was she going to say, and why didn't he want you to hear it? Getting back to the farm, you have another chance to look around, and you find out Kenny and Lily have been arguing again. This time, the argument seems to revolve around whether the farm is actually safe and if the St. Johns are hiding something. They seem to agree that something suspicious is going on, but while Lily just wants to let it go, leaving after a good meal, Kenny wants to snoop. This is the first chance you have to explore the barn, and upon talking to Kenny, you're introduced to a locked door in the back of it. He says Andy was locking it up as they came in, and that he seemed to be acting very shady about it. With a little investigation and some subterfuge, you manage to get the door open and discover a butcher's room complete with saws and blood everywhere. Andy catches you snooping and explains the whole thing away as nothing more than a place where they butcher and clean animals that they've hunted down. As easy as that explanation is to accept, it still seems a bit odd that they would be so secretive about it. Finally getting into the house for dinner, Lee is told he can wash up in the washroom down the hall. Before he can wash his hands, though, an odd noise and an extension cord going up the stairs draws him to investigate the second floor. The extension cord leads to a closet, and inside you find some medical supplies and waste, including IV tubes and saline. That wouldn't necessarily be the weirdest thing, as those supplies could come in handy if needed, but the extension cord going into a small hole in the wall does seem odd. Going into the bedroom near the closet, you find a bookcase that can be moved aside to reveal a door. Behind that door is where the whole situation breaks open. Mark is lying on the floor, both his legs missing. He's alive, though barely, and he tells Lee not to eat dinner. Putting two and two together, Lee rushes downstairs to warn everyone. A few people have already started eating, and Clementine is in the process of taking a bite when you burst in. You only have a second to stop her, and the next few moments are chaos as you reveal what you found, and the St. Johns admit everything. It turns out that in addition to the fresh fruits, vegetables, and cow's milk they've got on the farm, they've also been eating people. And this is where we dive into a moral dilemma that's at least as old as mankind itself. Is eating your own species morally acceptable? The most famous example of this dilemma comes from 1846. A group of pioneers heading west through the Sierra Nevada mountains became stuck in a snowstorm. They didn't have nearly enough food to survive more than a few weeks, and it wasn't long before members of the party began dying from exposure to the elements and starvation. In a desperate moment, several members of the Donner Party decided that eating those who had died was better than starving to death. At one point, they even murdered two of the Native American guides that were with them to eat them as well. Let's set aside the ick factor for just a minute, as I'm sure the vast majority of people would say that eating another human being is disgusting as a concept. Most people would probably even say that they would never consider it. But starvation makes you do things you wouldn't think possible. Remember the calories we talked about earlier? Those calories help you move, work, and think. Not getting enough of them means your body starts to break itself down, and the part of your brain responsible for rational thought starts shutting down as well. From an article on eating disorders, linked in the description below, comes the following. When a person is malnourished, their brain is not adequately fueled. They struggle to make decisions, solve problems, and regulate their emotions. This means that decisions you wouldn't make on a full stomach might seem a little more rational when hunger sets in. So, maybe hunger drives you to consider eating your fellow survivors. Is that decision moral? Strictly speaking, from a secular morality standpoint, Eating a person who had passed away from natural causes to sustain yourself and hopefully make it through a bad situation wouldn't be immoral. In fact, in the drive to maximize well being, it would be the right thing to do. If you're on the verge of starvation, about to die, any nutritional value at all would be important. But does the human body offer enough nutrition to make it actually good for you? According to an article from the Smithsonian Magazine, also linked below, a study of the caloric value of the human body showed it isn't really worth eating over the long term. The study was primarily looking at cannibalism in early humans and trying to determine the cause, with the conclusion being that it was most likely more ritualistic than anything else. The average human body contains around 125,000 calories, which seems like a decent amount, but it wouldn't really be enough to sustain more than a couple of people for very long when compared to something like a cow that averages 700,000 calories in total. So, while eating a person might help you get through to a time where better food is available, it isn't something where keeping people to eat makes any sense. And that brings us back to the St. John's. We're never really given an origin story for the cannibalism, but it's made very clear that they have plenty of food on the farm. The cow provides fresh milk that can be turned into butter and made into other things like cheese, and they have crops growing as well. And that begs the question, what drove them to eat people? Surely, there's still wildlife to hunt. We see a rabbit at the start of the episode that was being eaten by a zombie, and there has to be a lake or stream with fish in it not too far from the farm if they want meat. Why start eating people in the first place? But let's assume they went through something that drove them to that point. Now they're in a position where they're keeping people alive to eat. Mark had an arrow in his shoulder, something he could have easily recovered from. But they cut off his legs and made an extra effort to keep him alive so they could finish him off later. They've crossed the line from doing something socially unacceptable to survive and moved into straight up murder. We even have to call into question if they targeted the group for this in the first place. Did they really need gas for the generators? Or was it all a ruse just to get them back to the farm so they could be slaughtered one by one? Getting back into the moment in the dining room, an argument breaks out and guns are drawn before Lee is knocked out by one of the brothers. When he finally wakes up, he finds himself locked in a storage cooler with Lily, Larry, Kenny, and Clementine. Larry is pounding on the door, furious at being held hostage, and Kenny is pacing the room, worried about Katja and Duck, who the St. Johns are holding hostage somewhere. The situation would be bad enough, but then Larry suffers a heart attack. And now we find ourselves stuck with another decision to make. Lily is trying to perform CPR, and Kenny is saying that they need to make sure Larry won't come back and eat them. As Lee, you have to decide whether to help Lily try to save Larry, or help Kenny ensure the old man is dead. The obvious choice here is to help Lily save her dad. Larry's heart might have stopped, but performing CPR could get it started again. But Kenny can't be convinced, and he winds up throwing a massive block of salt on Larry's head as you start chest compressions. Even through all of that, the group makes it out of the cooler, and it's only a few short moments before you have the next set of moral choices to make. First, you have to decide whether to kill or spare Dan. There's a brief struggle with him before he steps into a bear trap that he'd been setting up in the barn, and Lee winds up standing over him, pitchfork in hand. Killing him might feel like getting revenge for Mark, but is it the right choice? A few minutes later, you find yourself in a similar situation with Andy. What should you do? Our society typically looks at revenge as punishment. Locking someone up in jail or executing them in an official way is having them pay their debt to society. But in reality, those actions don't actually do anything positive. If the threat of punishment worked as a good deterrent, then no one would ever commit any crime, or at least it wouldn't be as common. Punishment only serves to make victims feel better, and it doesn't even really do that in the long run. If we look at it from that perspective, punishing the St. Johns by killing them doesn't really do anything positive. What it does do, however, is prevent them from hurting others in the future. But, in this circumstance, it's also adding blood to Lee's hands that doesn't need to be there. The farm has fallen, the matron is dead, killed by a reanimated Mark in the house, and zombies are crawling all over the place. They aren't going to survive long enough to harm anyone else as it is, so killing them with your own, Lee's, hands isn't worth it. Leaving the chaos of the farm behind them, there's one more moral choice to make. The group finds a car filled with supplies just sitting in the woods. The keys are in the ignition, the dome light is on, and one of the doors is open. You have to decide whether to take the supplies or not. Taking them could mean dooming someone else to starving or worse. On the other hand, if the owner of the car is no longer among the living, then they are free to whoever gets them first. Morally speaking, the supplies don't belong to you. But as we discussed in episode 1, the rules of the world have changed. What would be considered stealing in our modern world would be considered necessary to survive in a world overrun by zombies. Living in a time where every morsel of food and drop of medicine is precious, isn't leaving your supplies unattended just asking for someone else to come along and take them? I would argue that the right thing to do would be to leave the supplies, or at least back off and wait to see if anyone comes back to them. If someone does show up, you could perhaps barter with them. No matter what you decide, the group as a whole goes their own way and takes everything. As the episode ends, we discover a recording on a camera Lee had discovered at the supposed bandit camp earlier, with the woman Dan shot recording a video of Clementine and talking about the bandits. In the next episode, we'll find out just what meeting and dealing with the St. John's meant for the future of the group, and we'll see just how Kenny responds when his family faces a crisis. He was rather quick to make sure Larry didn't come back from the dead, but is he consistent with that judgment? What choices would you make if you were in Lee's shoes? Was trying to save David the right move? What about not shooting Jolene or sparing the St. John's brothers? Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any future breakdowns. Hit the like button and head over to Patreon if you'd like to support the channel in other ways and get some cool extras. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.